everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. And on today's show, we have a really fascinating discussion about insects. Yep, about insects, a subject about which I know almost nothing, but our guest today is an expert. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present you with Professor Jeffrey H. Cohen, who contacted me and said, I think you should talk about insects. So, Jeffrey, tell us about yourself.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. My name is Jeffrey Cohen. I'm a professor of anthropology at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And over my career, I've had the opportunity to study several different things. And one of the topics I'm working on currently is the consumption of insects or entomophagy in southern Mexico.
Wow. So tell me what else you're doing, because I know that you've had a variety of things you've been doing, and I'm glad you pronounced that, entomophagy, because I wasn't quite sure. Again, not knowing a lot about insects and the way they are consumed. So you've been working in Mexico and Oaxaca, I believe, and specifically the toasted grasshoppers, or the chapulines, is what we're going to be talking about today, and the subjects around that. Is that right?
Exactly.
That's fantastic. Yes. Well, let's start, because I hope people are listening to this, because it'll be a fascinating subject. But there's a great deal of the population in the world, which is nearly 8 million people, who actually do eat insects. And so why don't you talk to us about that? Because I think it's it's a vast amount.
Sure. My pleasure. So we have 8 billion people. About 2 billion, give or take one or two, are gonna eat insects in some part of their diet. They're going to practice entomophagy. There are over 2,000 different species of insects that are consumed. Wow. And they show up across 3,000 different ethnic groups and 130 different countries.
Can you give us an example of, because people do know a little bit about Mexico, or certain areas of Mexico, certainly eating insects, but can you give us some of the ideas where the other ones are? Because a lot of that I just know. Who knew? Well, I didn't. You obviously did. That 130 countries ate insects.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing if you think about it. The countries tend to be in the tropical regions. They are really in almost every continent. So you can find people eating insects in the Americas, in Mexico, Central America, South America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia. In all of these places, we find the consumption of insects by different populations. There's a little bit of, specialization in certain places. Sometimes you find groups of people that are consuming more of one species, like the people I work with who are eating grasshoppers. Other times it's eating grubs. So it's not just the insect, but it's the insect in different points in its life cycle. And also the kind of the byproducts, like honey, for example. We don't really think of it as an insect byproduct, but it is.
Oh, wow. Yes, of course it is. Well, tell me about the farming of it as well, because you're saying that there is some farming of insects, but primarily you're telling me it's semi-domesticated. Is that the right way of calling it?
Yeah. So, I think it's a funny word, semi-domesticated. Yes. I always have the image of people kind of riding horses and roping grasshoppers or something like that. But the way it gets used is to say that there are certain patterns that we can find in the production of insects that really have move them into what we could think of as a semi-domesticated kind of category. So where I do a lot of my research in southern Mexico in Oaxaca, people are harvesting grasshoppers called chapulín. They're harvesting them from very specific fields, and those are fields of maize, of corn, and fields of alfalfa. And both of those fields are really conducive to supporting the grasshoppers, and so you get this sort of semi-domesticated outcome. In other places, we find people that do, in fact, farm. There are in North America, there are a lot of cricket farms that are focused on producing feed for other animals. So chicken feed, for example, sometimes it will include crickets as the protein, and crickets are pretty easy to farm. You just need a big building and a good, a kind of regular heat, and they'll take care of themselves. Other places, and generally, if you look across the history of entomophagy, it's going into the wild and finding the insects. But again, where we're, as humans, interacting with that environment, we're more than likely managing it to help kind of support the increase in the growth of the different insects that we're going to consume.
Wow, I love that, and the fact that you're saying that 2 billion people practice eating insects, and you were saying when you wrote to me that you said that people might assume that this is to kind of in a response to disasters or kind of interruption to once normal foods for many people around the world. They're actually welcome. They love these insects, and I wonder what you could talk about that, because I have eaten insects. I've been to Mexico. I've been to there's a place in London that sells insects and sell from West Africa. So I've eaten them, and I'm not just doing it because it's clever or because I'm doing it because I want to try them, and I actually find them rather tasty, I have to say.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know, that people aren't just eating these because they're having a disaster or some kind of interruption to what they're eating.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I couldn't agree more that insects are just food. They're not, a thing that people are going to turn to in a moment of crisis, but ignore otherwise. The best example I can give you comes from the work that we've been doing in southern Mexico. So there's another insect. I work with people who are producing chapulín, which are the grasshoppers. Every spring, right at the start of the rainy season, another insect emerges. It's called a chiquitana, and a chiquitana is a flying ant, and they only come out once a year. And the absolute joy of watching little kids chase and grab the chiquitanas and just eat them. You realize how wonderfully, how happy they are to have these things, and it's just a special moment. It's a highlight. I mean, everybody looks forward to it, and it's not in any way thought of as, well, this is what I have to eat because I don't have, a hamburger or something. So, watching that joy, you really see just how wonderful entomophagy can be.
Oh, well, let's talk about entomophagy. So, did I get that right? Yes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about it in the past, because obviously this is a history show as well. But I love them talking about this. So tell us about the past and where you may have discovered some things there and brought it forward to the future as well.
Right. Yeah. So it's very clear that humans, early humans, other hominins, we all ate insects, and they were a really important part of the diet. They're rich in protein. They're not hard to catch, and particularly if you're in a setting where you have this abundant resource, why not use it? And the assumption that we would, as early humans, that we would opt to spend a lot of energy hunting. I think it's kind of like you have your meal on your plate, and you're going to eat it, and it's going to be delicious. And there wasn't that sense, of people thinking, oh my gosh, I'm eating insects. That was the food that people were eating. And one of the most interesting recent findings actually looks at the value of insects as a benefit for pregnant women and new moms through not just early human history, but to the very present, as a resource that's easily accessible, high in protein, easily digestible, and something that really supports the well-being of a new mother, of a child that's, say, post-weaning age, and so forth. So these are things that I think there's part of the story is we don't like thinking about eating this stuff because we don't eat them, but they were very much a part of the world.
And when you talk about those, you always say that people who choose to eat insects always think of them as being very nutritional, the people who really do it. So tell us about what they have in them, as it were. And
Okay.
apparently they're also useful for people trying to lose weight, which I need to do. I definitely need to do. But so tell me about those, and let's go from that way.
Sure. So most insects that you're going to eat are very high in protein. The chapulin that we work with, and the chapulineras, the women that produce them, chapulin can be up to 70% protein, just pure protein. These are grasshoppers. Yeah. They also have a lot of trace elements. They're high in iron. So in a funny way, they are useful in terms of fiber as well, because the exoskeletons are not usually digestible. And so that becomes kind of raw fiber in your system, as I understand it. One of the really cool things I like about grasshoppers is that they have an amino acid that when you cook them, they turn bright red, like a lobster or a shrimp. Yeah. It's the same exact amino acids that are changing. So it's very cool.
I wonder, are they related to those at all, or do they just have the same?
I don't know. There's actually a person who calls them land langostinos. So
well, that's probably,
I like that.
Yeah, I like that. That's probably a gooder way to describe them as anything. And you've also have been telling us more about how they're, you've been telling us now, but how suitable they are for the planet. And it's one of those things that we should be hopefully trying to, but I think we're probably never going to have some areas that do. You're not going to ask them to have, in Ohio, perhaps, or places like that. But you do tell us that they are very sustainable for all these reasons. Perhaps you could tell us about that.
So any of these insects are quite sustainable in terms of their production. I mean, they're small. They don't take up a lot of space. They actually don't use up a lot of resources. You don't have to give them a lot of inputs. Sometimes it can be a problem, right? I mean, you can have a swarm of locusts show up and destroy a field, and you're not really thinking that it's dinner, but it is. But you can farm them pretty easily. Grasshoppers are actually a little harder to farm than some of the other
when you say
insects.
Farm them, what do you mean?
So if you want to farm,
farm,
you can actually farm. Yeah,
it's my British accent. I'm sorry, I couldn't get.
That's okay. I'm from Ohio, so English might be my second language. So farming them, one of the things that happens is you create a place for them to breed and grow. And it doesn't have to be really big, and it doesn't have to have lots of resources present. The insects don't eat a lot. Um, they don't need a lot of space. So you can support them pretty easily. There are some challenges around reproduction and breeding. Grasshoppers are a little less likely to breed in captivity than, say, crickets. Crickets are really easy to grow. The challenge, and this is something that we learned doing the research that we do, the challenge is that I might think a cricket and a grasshopper are almost the same sort of thing, but they're not. And the women that we work with were very clear that nobody should ever eat a cricket, that they taste horrible. That grasshoppers are sweet and crickets are bitter, and so you want to stay away from them. But crickets are being farmed, particularly for feed, in raising other sorts of animals. Crickets are also showing up in things like as like amendments that you can put into flour to increase the protein levels.
Oh,
And you can find that stuff on, if you go to any websites that, marketing websites, you'll find advertisements for cricket flour that you can add, or cricket flour that's been prepared to cook with. We did some experimenting here with the cricket flour, creating a couple of different treats for people, and then asking them to sample and talk about what they were eating. And while you could taste the cricket and everything, it was not that hard to mask
oh.
and make it pretty delightful.
I love that. Maybe I'm going to have to get myself some cricket flour and keep it. I wonder how long that would last as well. Would the crickets go off? Is the
I don't know. That's a really good question.
Because the Neanderthals and stuff started to eat insects, and they were considered, you the first people really to have them. And you were telling this was about natal and neonatal care. So before we move on, let's talk about that natal and neonatal care. And that is, for anyone listening who doesn't know that, we're talking about childbirth. And so tell us what you can, if there's anything we have discovered about the Neanderthals and the people after them. Did they catch them just when they were out and about, and then they decided to put them in things? Did they catch them because they wanted to? And then how you put those together into this natal and neonatal care.
Yeah. So the neonatal connection here is that it's a really good protein source.
Right.
So for a pregnant, for a Neanderthal waiting for their baby, I guess, it's a great protein source, and it's one that's probably easily accessible. So one of the things that I would imagine people might have seen, who are listening, is some of the movies of Jane Goodall,
Yeah.
documenting chimpanzees who are using tools to get termites and such to eat. And we can pretty much assume that something like that was going on, that Neanderthals or other early humans were using tools to actually harvest insects. And it might have been something as simple as a little piece of straw or something that was wet that could attract them, or it might even be that they were farming the insects. So we know that, for example, dating back at least 2,500 years ago, we can find evidence of people breeding silkworms.
Oh, okay.
And consuming them.
Oh.
In the record. These are things found in ruins in Shanxi province in China. They show up in the Altamira caves. You can see paintings of edible insects and wild bees. So they're there. They're there for us to find.
What's interesting to me though is how the silkworms wouldn't have been kept because they produce silk rather than. And I'm just wondering about that.
For eating. Yeah, I don't quite know how they were consumed, but that's what the
Oh,
report I was reading was talking
oh
about.
wow. So
So,
tell us about
yeah.
though. Once you've got them by the Neanderthals, how were they started to kind of be consumed? By 2 billion people, which is a lot. It's a
Yeah.
quarter of the population.
Right, right. It is a lot. And then again, I think the assumption that people are consuming them because they don't have access to the foods that they want is a mistake. They're consuming them because these are their traditions and they love them and they taste good. And so we find that while in the past, I mean, in talking about the deep past, we might be talking about eating raw insects. A lot of what we see today are they're being prepared, they're being cooked, they're parts of dishes. In the communities that we're working in, people are eating sometimes raw, like the chiquitanas that I mentioned. People just will run around and grab them and eat them, and they're just delicious. But they'll also do things like turn them into a filling for a taco, or they'll
Which is
turn
what
them
I had
into,
when I was there.
and they're
They
delicious
are
like that,
they
honestly.
and
Yeah.
for anyone listening who was going, "Oh, I don't want to listen to this. This sounds horrible." They are absolutely delicious. I mean, they
They
really
are.
are delicious. Oh, and you
Yeah.
put me
No,
thinking
I
about them now.
completely agree. I'm happy to eat them. It's funny. The very first time I had them, um, I was with one of the men that I was working with. We were doing some interviewing, and he asked me if I wanted to try them. And he was so smart. He knew exactly how to present them to me because he said, gringos don't eat insects. So he looks at me and he just says, "These have so much protein, and you won't get fat."
Yeah,
He knew exactly what to say. So
I think that
I was hooked.
I
I
think
was hooked.
all the people listening should listen to that.
Yeah.
So you've been talking about chimpanzees and things like that. Um, you were saying that the early kind of hominins lived in like rich wooded environments. Was that what they were looking for?
That would be part of it. And it would not be hard to find because insects would just be there. And the the range of possibilities is just pretty dramatic. It doesn't we think about eating a grub or eating a grasshopper. Um, Most insects, we can consume. We're just our challenge is that from the West, we're disgusted by them, and so it's hard to think about eating them. We would look at a bug and think that means that something's dirty, not something's ready to be eaten. So it makes it hard.
Now let's think about some of the other nations because you've talked about Mexico,
Sure.
but let's talk about one of the first things I'm going to mention. So my wife is Filipino, and so
Hmm.
whenever she thinks about it, she thinks of something called salagubang. I think I've pronounced that correctly. She'll probably
Hmm.
shout to me from the other room if I've got that wrong. um, and what other things? Because you were talking about how they're prepared, so let's talk
Right.
about how they're prepared in such a. And again, I love them when I've eaten them. I've eaten them in all these places. So, can you tell us about how they're prepared, and particularly about salagubang? I hope I've got that right. Otherwise, she'll kill me.
So that's one that I don't know a whole lot about. So I
Okay,
apologize. But the production of insects for consumption um, really follows very local traditions, I think. And so one of the places that I've really enjoyed reading about is the presence of insect consumption in parts of West Africa. They have some really interesting
which
traditions,
areas of
and
West Africa? Because I have been there
so this
and I haven't.
this is in places like Burkina
Okay,
Faso and Nigeria and the Congo, among others. Um, one of the things that's a real popular food is a caterpillar
Oh.
called I'm not going to pronounce it right, but it's a caterpillar called Serenia, and I'm not sure what the local name is, but it's one that's used in lots of different preparations, whether it's being kind of sautéed or deep fried,
Ooh.
and it becomes an addition to a meal, but it's also become a part of several really incredible projects where um, women in particular are creating, are becoming very food secure.
Ooh.
So this the celebration of these traditional foods, and the fact that a lot of outsiders don't want to eat them, it sort of guarantees, full stomachs, and people enjoy eating these things. So it's become like a real business model. And again, these are things that you can look for. There's several groups that are producing, working in collaboration with women in countries like Burkina Faso to market these market insects, market caterpillars to the wider audience, and they're being it's being picked up, which is really really interesting. So I think that's really quite cool. You can look at in Southeast Asia, throughout Southeast Asia, not just in the Philippines, but throughout the region, you see lots and lots of different examples of insect consumption and lots of different preparations, whether it's kind of a silly preparation of a um, scorpion in a lollipop,
Oh, you
for,
see
for
that?
dessert,
Okay.
or something that's fried and ready to eat. Um, and
And
again,
which countries
if
in
you
Southeast Asia, apart from the Philippines, which we've mentioned, what kind of countries in Southeast Asia would be eating insects? And again, what I'm finding really interesting is that people look at the people in West Africa, and obviously that's had
mhm,
some food insecurity, but they're not eating them because of that. They're eating, and
right,
that's a.
right.
Just could you talk me through that though?
Yeah, yeah. So you find that again, because these are foods that are traditions, people are not being forced to make a choice to say, "Well, I'm hungry. This is what I have to eat." They're actually making choices about how they want to eat, and one of the things they want to eat are these insects. Um, so whether it's a chapulín in Mexico, a caterpillar in Burkina Faso, a scorpion in Thailand, all these things kind of come together, and they for us from the outside, coming from Western countries, we look at it and we think, wow, that's just so weird and just so off-putting. But for the people who grow up with these traditions, it's like popping popcorn in your mouth. And in fact, that's one of the ways people talk about the grasshoppers. They're like popcorn,
Uh,
so you just get to eat
Out
them.
of interest, are there any Western, kind of nations like in the EU or anything that are eating insects, not as a kind of here I am and I'm eating an insect, aren't I clever? But is there any
Yeah.
ones who are eating insects?
Well, I'm not sure that we're eating insects, but we're certainly eating insect byproducts because you find
Yeah.
honey everywhere, and so we all love honey. And don't think very long about what honey might be,
Yeah.
but we do all enjoy it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got a jar here that I'm using to, for
Yeah.
sweeten, whatever I'm eating. So I love that a lot. So it's very interesting. Okay, now let's talk about some let's talk about some history as well,
Sure.
because
Sure.
you've got a lot of recipes, but particularly the mole chicatana. So let's talk about. Just talk us through the recipes that you've got because they are
Sure.
really great when I've heard them.
So I'm an anthropologist by training, and the majority of my life I have spent studying migration patterns of migration. And I can tell you that I made a big mistake because I should have been studying food all along. when you study food, you get to eat it,
Yes.
and when you get to
Yes, you
eat it,
do.
it's all very
Yes,
delicious,
you
you know.
do.
And so so just a few recipes that are just, I think, super special. Um, and one of them it's called mole de chiquitana, and a mole is a sauce that is very common to southern Mexican
It's
cuisine.
delicious.
There, it
I
represents lots of different
Yeah.
sauces. The This one is a chocolate and chile
Oh,
sauce, and so what you want to
I'm
start
feeling
with?
really hungry now
Yeah,
because they're
I
so
know.
great, the mole that we get there. Anyway.
Well, if you come to Columbus, I'll take you to a really good mole
Oh,
shop. We have one,
oh.
so it's very very good. I love going there. So they don't serve mole de chiquitanas, but this is how we would do this. Part of the reason they can't serve mole de chiquitanas is that these are critters that show up very briefly at the start of the rainy season. They emerge from their their um, their their nests, and you just got to grab them and eat them. So you take about a kilo, so it's about what 2.5 pounds of flying ants, which sounds I'm sure it sounds really exciting. You prepare them by quickly boiling them. You put them into boiling water just very briefly, so that it just that's how you prepare them. And in the water, you've got some salt and some garlic and maybe some onion. Okay,
Yep.
and then what you want to do is get your mole together. And so, because I work with people who don't really have cookbooks, this is what they tell me. They say, you want to get about a kilo of mole. And so, you want to get enough oregano, onion, cinnamon, raisins,
Oh,
fried plantains, some breadcrumbs, some chicken, some guajillo chilies, and some ancho chilies. And you're going to throw all of that together into a pot. And then you're going to add your chiquitanas to that pot. Um,
you put here that you remove the head. I wonder how people began to
ah,
understand removing the head.
right. I'm sorry. Yes, I skipped that. You have to remove the heads. Generally, it's not a hard thing to do. So particularly after they've been cooked. So and then you need to grind up the chiquitana, so they're not floating in the mole, but they're part of the mole. They're integrated
Oh,
as a flavor into the mole, and then you fix up your chicken. You basically would take a piece of chicken, and then put it on the plate. You have your mole sauce that has the chiquitanas kind of integrated into it, and you pour it over the top. It's absolutely delicious. Eat it with some rice and some tortillas.
we'll get people to, if you don't mind, when we share some of them, we'd love to share some of these online on our Eat My
Sure.
Globe. And another one that you've mentioned is sal de gusano. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which is
So salte gusano is like a flavor. It's a salt.
okay.
It translates as worm salt, and it's made with.
I love this.
It sounds I know that sounds so delicious, doesn't it? So it's made with the worms or the larvae that are found inside of a maguey cactus that you're going to make, and you're going to use that cactus or the agave. You're going to use it to make tequila or mezcal, and you take the critters out, and you again you cook them. They turn red. You grind them up. You add them to just regular salt, and it makes this very pungent kind of salty topping.
It's like adding truffles to salt.
Sure,
It's funny.
exactly.
I'm certain here in Los Angeles we could buy those fairly.
Oh,
We could
absolutely,
buy that fairly
absolutely.
easily.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to go and try it.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
you've got me. What I love about this and the whole episodes is that we I get so excited by everything that I have to go and try them all. Even you, when you're talking about the insects, they sound so delicious. And you had that worm salt, and it's oh. Anyway, so those are great recipes. So thank you for that. But let's talk about some of the other nations. Let's talk about the future. So tell us what they were doing, and then tell us when when we come to the future. Is it always going to be in America, in Britain, in those kind of places? Is it always going to be something that anyone takes just because?
There are a lot of researchers, particularly in Europe, who are really pushing a shift to eating the consumption of insects. And it's I wish I felt more positive about what they're trying to do. I feel like it's I feel like it's a nice goal. I'm not sure it's a goal that we can get to anytime soon. It's not that humans can't eat insects, because we absolutely can, and there are more than enough people eating them every day to show us that we can do this. It's that in Western cultural systems, we don't eat them, and we tend to think of them as dirty and dangerous, and so it makes it really, really hard. One of the ways that you find lots of, like, North Americans eating insects is they'll eat them as a dare, or they'll eat them as, something sort of special. They'll come to a place like Oaxaca, where I work, and they want to try chapulines so that they can say that they've tried them. They don't want to try them to start eating them.
Why do you think that is? Why do they have a very separate, from the 2 billion people who eat them and love them? Why do you think that is?
I think it has a lot to do with what's called this yuck factor, which is insects are just assumed to be yuck, and therefore people will not pick them. They're off putting, um, and it's surprising, because work has taken place where you know researchers ask the everyday person, like, would you eat an insect? And nine, very often they'll say, sure, absolutely. Um, but it's sort of fantasy rather than reality. And the reality is that they really won't, even though they might voice a kind of a willingness. It's unfortunate, because the opportunity and the value that shifting the diet towards insects could carry are just positives, right? It's a very high protein food. It makes a very small impact on the environment. It's the kind of food that really anybody can eat. There's not a lot of things that would say, well, you can't eat them. I mean, there's some evidence that there are places where insects are contaminated, and that we have to be
Where would
careful
that
about.
be?
But farming, well, there are certain places where, whether it's through the pots and pans that are being used to process them, that sometimes some dangerous things like heavy metals can get into them. But if there were rules on farming and they were being farmed, that stuff could actually be organized and managed. So I think there is a future. One of the other challenges, though, is that future, when it's somebody from, like, the United States, a food specialist, who says to somebody from another part of the world, well, you should eat insects, and that person says, why? And the person says, well, because it's a smart way for you to eat. That's probably not the right answer, right? You really want to encourage people to do these things because it's yummy, it's the history. I think there's space for what some people have called a renaissance in entomophagy, its reappearance as a thing. But the challenge is, how do we move it from someone saying, oh, great, I ate a bug, let me tell all my friends, to, I'm having chiquitanas because it's season and they are just delicious.
And they do sound delicious. So tell me about you. So I was beginning to ask you, how other nations were eating or began to eat them. And so you were telling me that there was a kind of a new tourism industry that people were going to, whether it's West Africa, whether it's Southeast Asia, and eating them, not because it's a dare, not because of anything, but because they wanted to try them. So is that happening now?
That is happening, and it's happening in lots and lots of places where people will go to certain restaurants, um, or the restaurants will kind of come to them, and they'll have the day right here. Let's taste the bugs. One of the things that's really cool is that you find lots of tours that so you get to a place, right? You get to Thailand, and you go on a tour of the markets, and that'll be part of the tour is trying these things. You come to Oaxaca and you get on a tour of one of the city's markets, and part of the tour is trying chapulín, for example. So it's getting this stuff in front of people, and that's, I think, really exciting, and it's a real positive way to grow acceptance, maybe.
Oh, we've talked through that, but and we've talked about their answer to hunger. So I think we've covered. But what do you think their future is?
I would say they're not going to disappear, right? The people who love insects, the 2 billion people who eat them, they're not going to stop. This is a really important part of their diet. I think we'll see some growth in other places of people beginning to eat. There's some people that will shift their diet for ethical reasons, some people that will shift their diet for health reasons. So those won't ever be big populations, but they'll be interesting pieces of the puzzle, I think. And there's always a possibility that the successes that these tourist programs have will translate into more people feeling more comfortable about eating insects, and we'll actually see a real increase. It would be good for the planet. That's absolutely clear, because they are sustainable. There's some funny outcomes. There is some work that shows that where the insects are very specific that are eaten, there are some examples of them being over harvested.
Oh, wow.
Which is a bit of a surprise. But I think that's an exception, not really the rule.
I think it's a good ending because you're saying they could be good for the planet. And that for me is the thing that we should always come back to. So I think from that point of view, now let's see. If Jeffrey was a meal, what would it be? Oh,
Yeah, this is a hard one because I really love eating, and it's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons I do what I do. But I decided sweet and sour style brisket.
oh, that sounds good.
That would be me.
So,
Made with tomato sauce and onions and celery and carrots and potatoes, very slowly roasted in a Dutch oven for a good part of a day, with maybe some fresh challah on the side. Now I'm really hungry.
And that sounds like the sort of thing that they would cook the day before, like a Sabbath meal. Is that almost?
Yes.
Oh, and I've been to many Sabbaths with my friends, and that's the sort of thing they cook because I'm getting really hungry now.
Me too.
Oh gosh, I'm just gonna have a thought and think about that for a moment. Oh, right. Okay. If Jeffrey had to go back in time to any meal or any point in time for that meal, where would that be? Oh.
Yeah. So this is one that I didn't have to think about very long, because while there are lots of cool meals I could be a part of, there's one meal that I can't have anymore, and this is my grandmother's stuffed cabbages.
Ooh.
And so she was just an amazing cook. She was Russian, and she would make all of this just amazing Eastern European food. And the thing that she would always make me for my birthday was stuffed cabbage. And I can honestly, when I talk about it, I can smell it and I can taste it. It's just that much in there. Um, and if I could just have one more meal with her, that I would be so happy to be
Oh,
able to go back there.
I
Um,
could probably. I've had like a Polish version of that when I had a long time ago when I had an old Polish girlfriend, and she used to make that for me all the time, and it was so. I mean, it was different, obviously, but
yeah, yeah,
similar, I think. But it was so. Oh gosh, now again,
yeah. Yeah,
now,
I can get delicious Polish stuffed cabbage here in Columbus, and the woman that runs the little place, it's in the North Market here in
yeah, yeah.
Columbus. She and I talk about like my grandmother's stuffed cabbage and her stuffed cabbage, and what makes them same and what makes them different. And yeah, it's amazing.
I actually love some of the Eastern European cooking that we get, and so I get that mostly when I go back to the UK because there's a lot of people from that part of the world coming over to the UK, and
Yeah.
they are just oh
So any good meal of stuffed cabbage, when it was with my grandmother, there was always a big box of what were called bow ties, and they're just they're like deep fried dough that are twisted so it looks like a little bow tie with sugar on top, and they're bland. I don't I don't know, but they just always went with dinner. So they always went with stuffed
I
cabbage.
think
You always had to have
you
it.
bring into that things that always you enjoyed. My grandmother, my Welsh grandmother, always used to make cheese straws that she and they were just pastry with a little bit of cheese on them. But I think it's because she made them and they were great.
It's exactly
Yeah.
it. It's exactly
Oh,
it.
I absolutely agree, and I different areas, but my Welsh grandmother was to me was one of the great bakers in the world. Whether she was or not, I don't care, but she was. Yeah.
For you, it worked.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
I love this. Now, if you had to go back in time to see the invention of anything, you tell me.
I decided I want to go with peanut butter,
Oh,
but not just any peanut butter. It has to be American peanut
yep.
butter because for me, peanut butter is the most amazingly important invention. Uh, you will never be hungry if you have a jar of peanut butter, and it'll always be fresh. I mean, I would imagine it might go bad, but generally it'll be fresh whenever you need it. And you can't find American peanut butter in lots of other places, or if you can, it's just incredibly
Yeah.
expensive. So one of the things, I mean, I've been doing a lot. I've done research as an anthropologist for quite a long time, and whenever I go, wherever I go, I always bring a jar of peanut butter with me,
Oh,
and it's because I know if I have peanut butter, I'm not going to be hungry. I'll be able to eat something.
well, I
And so for me, I'm going to say, yeah, peanut butter is just about the most important invention.
now, but I'm gonna ask you now because it's an important question, very important. Is crunchy or smooth?
Oof, crunchy.
Good. I'm on your side then. Phew, phew. And before we go, finally, let's talk about your social media and all that stuff because there's so many of them now. TikTok and Instagram and X, I think it's called. And so, if you're on any of those, just tell me what you look.
I'm 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 quite a Luddite. I'm not actually on, on a lot of these things. I the best one of the best ways to find me is to find me through my university. So at Ohio State, I am part of the anthropology department. I have a you can get to the department's page, and I'm on the faculty there, and it'll take you to my website. I actually have a lab that I run called the Transnational
Yes,
Research
yes.
Lab, and it's housed under my homepage there. So if you go to Ohio State, or if you just type in Jeffrey Cohen at Ohio State, it'll take you to my site, and that's probably one of the best ways to find me. There you'll learn about the books I've written, articles I have, what my amazing students do every day, and some of the great things that we do here at Ohio State.
Fantastic. Jeffrey, I have to say thank you, because I wasn't expecting this. It was a thought that I'd never had, and then you wrote to me and I went, that's a great idea. And I love when people write to me, particularly when there's people as brainy as you are.
Thank you.
And so, first of all, thank you. This has been a terrific conversation, and you have been a fantastic guest. So if anyone else is listening and they're kind of in this area, or if they're in a different area but they think I should cover it, please do what Jeffrey did and write to me, and then I'll consider it. But Jeffrey, this was a delight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was just, it's kind of like a dream. So, because I really like your show, and to be on it is pretty neat.
Fantastic. Make sure to check out the websites associated with this podcast at www.eatmyglobe.com, where we will be posting the transcripts from each episode, along with all the references and resources we used putting the episodes together, in case you want to delve deeper into each subject. There is also a contact button, so please do let us know if there are any subjects that you would like us to cover. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to join us on Patreon. Subscribe, recommend us to your family and friends, and give us a good rating on your favourite podcast provider. Thank you, and goodbye from me, Simon Majumdar. We'll speak to you soon on the next episode of Eat My Globe, things you didn't know about food. The Eat My Globe podcast is a production of It's Not Much, But It's Ours and Producer Girl Productions. We would also like to thank Sybil Villanueva for all of her help, both with the editing of the transcripts and essential help with the research.